Yeah. Where are those guys at? I didn't. Yeah. Diablo's a mess. I'd be down for Overwatch 2, maybe. Yeah. Do they do anything at E3? Did they have like a thing at E3 at all? Or? Yeah. Their company's seen some pretty weird stuff in the last year or two. After what's his name? Like, yeah. After he left. Yeah. Start. Is going to again. Yeah. Cool. We're gonna get started in a sec. Did you guys watch the game? Did you leave here in time to see any of it? Raptors last minute. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. Super close matchup. Well, once all the other team was injured. But we're gonna be looking at responsive design and a bit of stuff on SaaS today. Let's get this a little bit bigger. So you've had the whole week to kind of start diving into CSS, doing a little bit of front-end development with Twitter, and there might be some stretch stuff on Twitter to make it responsive, but so far we haven't looked at how do we make our web applications responsive, or how do we make our web applications so that they look good on a variety of devices. We want a dynamic experience so that like our font, layout, images, and any content that we have work with any device screen that someone might be viewing it on. And these days, the challenge is kind of extra hard because there are so many different devices that people can be viewing our content on. So we really have to make that experience good across a pretty big range. The goal is like a uniform UI experience, user interface experience for everyone. And today we're going to be focusing on how to do that with just CSS. I'm sure you've seen that like some simple CSS changes with our applications can drastically change the user experience. So we're going to be focusing on CSS. There's of course other ways that you can create more responsive designs, but CSS will be the main tool and what we'll be focusing on today. Some of the CSS tools that we'll be looking at are percentages, EMs, and view widths. These are things that you might have already used a bit or seen, and we're going to look at how we can use them to make something responsive. And then we're going to look at some things that are probably new, like media queries, Flexbox, and finally we're going to end on Sass. Sass being a tool to help us to write CSS faster and maybe cleaner, but not necessarily specifically for responsive design. We'll just look at it as a new thing in addition to responsive design. So to start off with, let's check out some websites. So Wikipedia here, not generally known for their forward and innovative design, but we can look at their site. So at like larger widths, it's fairly readable. You know, their purpose is to get their content across, and you know, if we can read and understand what they're trying to teach us, that's good. But as we shrink this down, it gets like real bad pretty quickly. You know, these smaller widths, we have these super elongated columns, and it's like pretty hard to understand. So in this case, we would say that Wikipedia has a not or unresponsive design. What are some things other than like these long columns that make this unresponsive or make this kind of not fun to deal with at the smaller, especially view widths? Yeah, we got to scroll horizontally a lot to view even similar content. What other things kind of can we see? Oh, you said horizontally. Yeah, we got to do this. Even just like the multiple columns in smaller sizing, that's like super annoying. Like, why would I need 3 columns for this content? The text itself is pretty small. But in contrast, if we look at something maybe like GitHub's pretty good. If we look as I shrink this browser, we get a couple things happening. So when I get smaller here, much easier to read. We have this like single column. If we also look at the menu up top here, it changes when I'm at different spaces. So in particular, we're seeing a couple things. We're seeing there's like these popping points. Like here we have 3 columns. I bring it smaller. We pop into 2 columns. And again, there's another spot here where we're jumping from 2 columns to 1 column. But in general, much cleaner to see. And even the menu having this drop down now, that's much easier on the smaller devices on something like mobile. So way more responsive than this. Wikipedia is not putting our the donations to design, apparently. The other cool tool when we're thinking about responsive design is when we have developer tools, we have these 2 buttons here. This one on the right is the device. This looks a little weird, but I'm not sure why the menu's not showing correctly. That's probably more on this developer tools thing than on actual GitHub. But you can select a bunch of different devices. So if we click this down, we've got like Galaxy, Pixel 2, iPhone, a bunch of different ones. If I want to see what this site looks like on iPhone X, I just select it from the drop-down, and I can kind of see what their layout would look like. Similarly with like Wikipedia, if we go on mobile. It's probably even worse than what we saw before because it is so small and not great.
Is when you change the responsive or the size setting, is that simply the dimensions of the window, or is it doing anything else?
Oh, when I click this, yeah. So we'll look at this a bit more later, but it changes the dimensions and it also changes how the browser is actually looking. So what we can do, if I don't know if I can go 320 pixels, but if I set this just to like normal and I bring it down to 320, oh wow, look, it is looking different this time. I don't know why that is. Oh, that's because I'm at a specific. Let's see. So if I bring this down to 320, which was what the phone size, I mean, look at how that looks. Like it's obviously vertically longer, but we compare it to this, it's different. So this is, we see less content, and this we see like more content. It looks like this is zoomed out, this version, and this version is zoomed in. So that has to do with how devices set the like scale of the content that they're viewing, and they do it a bit different than browsers do. So that's something we can do with our responsive design to know when it's a device that's using it, so we can make it so that it's not, if we just have the full web page kind of scrunched in to view on a mobile, it gets really small, and that's kind of what they're doing here. So today, where is it? We're looking at like CSS with responsive sites. Some sites use mobile versionings to serve different user interface, and so when we look at this versus this, it's the same site. Before it switched to the sometimes they do m.Wikipedia, or you'll see m.YouTube. They're actually serving a different version of the website entirely. So it's not the same HTML, CSS front end stuff that's being delivered. Right now, we want to be focusing on like how can we give the same web page to someone, but have it be dynamically styled based on the sizing, instead of saying, if they're viewing a small site, I'm going to give them, or a small device, I'm going to give them one version of my page. And if they are viewing on a computer, I'm going to give them a completely other version. That's another way of doing responsive design, and lets you really customize what you're showing them. But today we're going to be focusing on trying to do as much as we can with CSS. So we already have some responsive tools maybe we've seen. Percentages, EMs, VWs, which stand for view widths, that we can do a decent amount of responsiveness with. So if I just make a new project directory, I'm going to call it responsive. I'm going to make an index HTML file, and I'm going to make this. And I'm going to make just a style.css. So I'll go into my text editor. We'll look into that new. Oh, yeah. I, of course, would need to go into my folder. And now that I've done it how I should have, let's look and open both of these guys up. So our index file, we're just going to make a pretty basic skeleton. We're going to include one style sheet. And that is located in the same folder, so we can just go style.css. And then we, of course, have, oh, we missed our HTML tag. We will have a body. And then we're going to use some like semantic HTML tags to build out our basic layout. So we'll have a header. And then below that, we'll have a main. And then at the end of that, we'll have a footer. And inside our main, just to kind of represent some content, we'll just have 3 divs. We'll just put a number inside this one, second div, 2, and a third div, 3. Now if we go into our style, we'll give our footer, header, some similar styling, and maybe we'll give them a height of 100 pixels and a background color of like salmon. And then we'll go down and we'll say our main. We could give this a background color as well if we wanted to. Maybe something like wheat. And then we'll go main, and we'll find the children of main, so the div children. Let's see, we'll give them a background color of what's sea green? That doesn't look salmon and wheat. We'll do like a light blue, maybe. Cornflower blue. Okay, we'll give it a cornflower blue. We'll see how that works. And then we'll give it the text color. We'll do salmon too. So we'll stick to like three colors. Then we'll have font size. We'll make this a bit bigger, maybe 40. I don't know, 40 pixels too much. And then we'll just do width, 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and align. Oh no, we'll do text align center, so our stuff appears in the middle. I'm just going to find it in my mess of a directory. Where am I? Okay, look at this style and design. So we have 1, 2, 3, our header, our footer. Let's make this a little bit nicer. So font size, let's definitely bump that up. Let's give it a line height to match its height. So if our height is 200 pixels, we'll give it a line height of 200 pixels. So we get kind of centered vertically. And then let's give each of these a margin of like 30 pixels or something. Oops. So we have our 3 guys like this. We probably want them to pre-display inline block, like we saw earlier this week. We can get them to show up, horizontally. So we got kind of a base layout. If we go to inspect, when we're really big, not that great. Our content's pretty small. And then when we get smaller, well, because we did them block, they are dropping down, so that's kind of nice. But in this range, they're kind of big, or they're kind of small, and there's a lot of empty space, and we get some empty space up here. So the first thing we can use is we can set our line height, our width, and our height, and even our font size if we want to be dynamic. We can use some dynamic units like view widths. That's probably way too big. So if I do 10 view widths, and then I do 30, that might be pretty big, but we'll see. And so what view widths are is we're setting the width of, or the size of whatever we're setting to be, so one view width is 1% of the view of our browser. So from this point all the way over to here, 1 would just be 1% of that. If I'm doing 30 for these guys, it's going to be 30% of my entire width. So if we save that, we refresh here, we have our 3 divs taking up a bunch of the space. And then as we shrink it, we have them shrinking to our browser size. When we get smaller, you get this drop, probably because the div itself, if we look here, we have this little bit of white space, which isn't dynamically set. So when we get small enough, that becomes enough of a percentage to like bump our stuff down. So we could set that dynamically, or I could just say, well, let's tone these down a little bit and make them like 28 or so refresh. Same thing, we get it nice. Content filling our screen when it's big, smaller, we get dynamically. So this is maybe nice for kind of medium ranges. Like my desktop or my laptop's not that big of a screen. So when I'm looking at it here, it's nice. But if we have like a really big monitor like this, the boxes get like crazy big. And if I have images in there, some content I might not be able to stretch to that big of a size. So for me, this is really nice from like like a medium size to like kind of small. But when it's really big, maybe my boxes are blown up too big. And when it gets small, we have that problem where the boxes just get like really small, and we still have 3 columns. So there's some problems with this, but generally we're getting some nice responsiveness in the like small, medium small to like almost large range. So the other tool that we can use, and this is probably more common or something you might have seen more often, is like percentages. And so we just said view widths was a percentage of the width of your browser. And so then it's like, well, why then do we also need something else that's like percentages? View widths and percentages, they function a little bit differently. So if I, in our main, which is our wheat colored guy, I give that a width of, say, 80%. And then I give it margin auto. Margin auto will just kind of center. If the div is not filling up as much as it can horizontally, margin auto will just space it so that there's equal spacing on the left and the right. So I refresh this. We get these 2 kind of gutters on either side. But what we'll see is that each of these divs we set to 30%. And they're not taking up 30% of the parent div. They're taking up 30% of the entire width of my browser's view. So that's what we'll see in a second, is the difference between view widths and percentages. My view width is based on the total view. Percentages are based on the parent's value. So if I set the width to 30%, and I set the height to 30%. I save, and we look at it now. Now we get it filling our parent div nicely. They look about 30% of each one. So when we want to set the size of something relative to the container that it's in, we can use percentages. And when we want to set it relative to the full width of the screen, we can use view widths. But there is another difference between the two as well. So you'll notice that I didn't do percentages on my font size. Let's try and see what happens if I do that. So if I do 10% font, and I save, we now don't see any font. And that's not because it isn't there. It's because if we zoom in a ton, we see this like small 2. And so the reasoning behind that is that percentages is not based on the parent's width. It's based on the parent's value for that same property. So when I say font size 10%, I'm saying do 10% of whatever the parent's font size is. When I say width 30%, I'm saying do width 30% of whatever the parent's width is. So if I, in my main, now go like font size, and I make it like some crazy big number, I don't know if, we'll see. Okay, that was obviously way too big. Nope. So we're doing 10%. There, so we get the numbers being now 10% of 1,000 pixels. So it's relative to the parent's value for that similar property. So the problem then is like that's not really responsive for font size. If it's just relative to the, like our parent's width right now changes, so the size of our children divs will also change. But when I'm changing the width of a screen or something, it doesn't affect the parent's font size. So my font stays, the same size regardless of how big it is. So the nice thing we can do is use a blend of view widths and percentages. For things like font size, view widths are nice. Like line height, that's something that has to do with font size too. Like view widths are nice. Maybe like margin, width and height, those are things that you can end up doing with percentages if you want to keep your elements within the bounds of their parent. You can still use view widths as well, as long as you know, like if you're setting the view width of your parent, so this wheat colored guy, if we set that to maybe 60%, then we can think, okay, our 3 child divs, we just want to set them to 20%. We don't want to exceed 60 because then we're going to get some overflow happening. If we don't want to think about those numbers, we can just use percentages. And we can say, well, now we'll just keep within 100%. And no matter what our parent is, we'll be fine. Any questions on like view widths or percentages? Cool. Oh, the last one I think it mentions here is EMs. Does anyone? You think you started to use this with Tweeter. Did anyone get a clear understanding of what EMs do for us? So EMs are another relative unit. They're kind of similar to how percentages work with font size, but for everything. So if my main has a font size of 100, EMs are relative to the parent's font size for anything I set them in. So if I do a width of 1 EM, that will be 100 pixels. We're using like 200 pixels before, or 300, so we'll go 2 EM and height 2 EM. I refresh. They're my, interesting. I don't know if font size 100 pixels. Oh, so this is cool. EMs are like relative to the closest kind of font size it can find. So because we have set font size here in the div itself to be view widths, then when we do width to EM, we're saying twice whatever the font size is. So 1 EM is the current font size. This is twice whatever the current font size is. So the current font size is 10 view widths. So we're accidentally getting a dynamic thing. But if I comment this out, or we'll just delete it for now, we have a font size of 100 in the parent. And that's the size that our view widths are based on now. So no longer dynamic. It's just 100, well, 200 because we did two EMs, 200 pixels and 200 height pixels. The benefit for using EMs is if I don't declare font size anywhere except in like maybe the root style. So like if I say my body and I give a font size, and there's specific units people use. People use like 12 or 24 or 16. 16 is very common. And I size everything else based on this number. So I go 1 EM here, 1.5 EM throughout my entire document. I have kind of one central source for my initial size on everything. If I want to scale everything up by like a factor of like 2, I just double this number. If I want to scale everything down, I can like half this number. Because all of the sizings will be based on this single font size. That would be like the benefit of using EMs. But for our case, when we want it to like shrink and grow, view widths and percentages are pretty nice. Okay. The next tool that we can look at that you probably haven't used very much yet are media queries. So media queries are useful when you want to modify your site or app depending on the device's type and special like characteristics. So parameters such as screen resolution or browser viewport width. This one being particularly useful. If we look into some of the Mozilla docs on media queries, this is the thing that was listed there. But with media queries, you're conditionally rendering style based on the first thing is the media type. So the media type describes the general category of a device. And we have only a couple here. We have all, which is all devices. We have print, screen, and speech. So when we're thinking of responsive design, we're going to be focused on screen. But print is, if I right-click this page and hit print, I can, as a developer, decide that print layout is going to look different than it just shows on the page if I selectively decide styles with this print selector. Speech, this is for accessibility. So if people are using speech readers to read your site, you can change how parts of your site show based on the speech selector. But for now, we're going to be looking at screen for our responsiveness. So with our media query, we select which media type we're selecting for. So we would be selecting screen. And then you select a media feature to do a query on. So we can do queries on the width of the device, the height, aspect ratio, orientation, and a bunch of other things. For our purposes, we're going to be focusing on width and height, where we're probably just going to be using width, to be honest, this time. So the kind of syntax of a media query is like this. We do the @media keyword to say that we're doing a media query, and then we can specify which media types we're screening for. So only screen will be how we use it. And then we have our media query or a feature expression that we include in brackets. So for this case, we're saying any screens when the width is at most 600 pixels, then apply whatever's in here. So for example, if we go into our style, and I go @media only screen, and I can do the one that we just saw, max width. I'll give it a bit bigger, 800 pixels. And then I say main. And I go background, color, blue. If I save this, and we open up our nice little layout here. First, okay, we have line height 30 width. Font size, this. Okay, if I shrink my view size down below 800 pixels, we see we get this pop from wheat to blue. So right, and when we're resizing with developer tools, in the top right here, you can see the, it'll tell you the current device size. So, but looking at that number, right as I get below 800, we get that style being applied to the main div there. So you can apply any style, and that's where maybe with GitHub we were seeing that like pop from 3 columns to 2 columns, and then even smaller from 2 columns to 1 column. That would have been done with like a media query. So that's how we can do it responsively. Changing the color when we get to lower sizes doesn't really help with responsiveness unless maybe like smaller font was more readable at a certain color or something like this. So let's try and get a more useful example. So maybe in our header, we want to add a new div. And in this div, we want to add a logo. We'll save that. In our style, we'll come down here, and we'll add a new selector for logo. We're going to say it's going to have a background image. And I have included a logo. I think it's a PNG, but it's in the directory above this, I believe. We're going to do background size contain, and that just makes sure that our image doesn't stretch outside of our div. And we'll give it a width of 150 pixels and a height of, I don't know the bounds of this image, but we'll see if that works. And we'll also do background repeat, no repeat, because if we don't get those height and width right exactly, we don't want to see the bottom of the image showing up again. So we'll refresh here, and we get Lighthouse Labs up there. That's pretty small. Let's go 300, 150, and we'll also give it a like margin 30 pixels or something. And we're pushing down from the top. Maybe instead of doing a margin, we'll go into our instead of going into margin, we'll go into our header, and we'll just give that a padding. Oh, actually, we have a header selector up here. We'll give this a padding of 30 pixels. There we go. So we have this nice logo up top. But what might be useful is when we get to the smaller sizes, if our logo like gets smaller too. So we'll check maybe when we're below 400 pixels, because 400 pixels right here, it could be nice to have a smaller logo at that point. So instead of 800, we're going to do 400. And instead of grabbing the main, we're going to do .logo. And at that point, we'll just have both our width. Here. We'll have our width and height stuff. So instead of 300, we'll go 150. And instead of instead of 150, we'll go 75. Save that, refresh. And as I shrink my view width, when I get just below 400, we have it pop down to be smaller. The other thing we could maybe do is like these, we said that these guys, when they get small, don't look very nice. So we could even do something like when it's 400 pixels, we're also going to grab main div, so those children, and we're going to make the width 100%. So now as we get smaller, we should probably do it sooner than 400, but when we get to 400, we get the logo jumping smaller, and then we get our divs to take up full width and kind of be now a more horizontal, or sorry, more vertical layout than like this horizontal layout. So with media queries, you can kind of just play with your website and see where it's not looking good or where changes might need to happen. So you can just like, scroll this sizing smaller and bigger, and you can say, okay, around here, maybe it'd be nice if this element was bigger, or if this layout was column, or if my logo got smaller, different things like that. The value that you're querying for, so you can do max width. We can also do something like at media only screen, and we can go min width if we want a style to be applied on everything above a certain width. So now if I did the main and I refresh it, anytime I get above 800, let's see. We're not getting it. Let's double check our query. So screen, main, minimum width, 800 pixels, background color, red. Min width. Not sure exactly why this one's not. Oh, maybe it's, I just missed a space there. That would be silly. Yeah. So we can say that for any sizes above 800 pixels, we want it red. So everything, up and bigger. And then the other one we have for any width smaller than 400, we have this thing. You can select above a number or below a number. And then the specific pixel value that you're deciding for, that's like totally up to you. There isn't like a specific standard like, oh, I need to do break points at 400 pixels and 800 pixels or something like that. One thing you can do is if you're designing maybe specifically, you're making an app and you say, I want to do iPads. You can come in here and see that iPad is 768 in width. And so then maybe 768 is where I want to include a breakpoint. But one thing we just saw, okay, this is in relation earlier to that question about device sizes. So if I'm looking at a Pixel 2, this is below, let's pick a smaller phone. If I pick the iPhone X, this is below that media query. This is 375 pixels, but we don't see our breakpoint being applied. In fact, the background's red. So right now, it's applying our above 800 pixel styling. And so what this has to do with is that with our devices, with our iPhones and different things, the browsers that they use do a virtual rendering of the content on the from any site that they visit. Initially, I think it was set to be scaled like this because responsive design wasn't such a common thing. So if I viewed this site, it would say just shrink it so that it kind of looks like it would look on mobile or something. But now with our media queries, we don't want it to be thinking that it's over 800 pixels. We want it to know the actual size of the screen dimensions so that we can correctly apply styles to it. And the way we fix that is just with one line that we can include in the head of our HTML. So it's a meta tag. Its name is viewport. We're saying content. We want the width. So the width that the thing is rendering at to be the actual width of the device. And we want to set the initial scale to 1. The scale thing is like if we wanted to change the scale a bit, we could set the initial scale to 2. So then if the phone's width is 400, the rendered width is 800. But for our purposes, we just want to do 1. So if I copy this, and in the head of my HTML, I paste it there. So again, I'm setting the viewport, and I want the viewport's width to be the actual device width, not some virtual one. And if we refresh this now our iPhone layout is according to the actual width of the iPhone itself. So it knows it's 375, so we get this nice thing. If I switch to, I think Pixel 2 is just over 400, we get the different layout because it's above 400 pixels. So something to keep in mind when you're using breakpoints is with media queries, you're going to need to always set this so that different device users will have the breakpoints happening at the correct size of their device. We'll take a quick break. We'll do 10 minutes maybe, come back at 9:56 or 9:55, and then we're going to look at Flexbox. Okay, we're gonna check out Flexbox now. So I feel like you guys have been teased with Flexbox for a bit. Monday we talked about it. Some of the readings are like, oh, Flexbox. So Flexbox is a way to display sets of items or lists of things in a more intuitive way, the way you can actually like kind of say, I want this to happen, and for once CSS is kind of going to do it for you. Flexbox lets us kind of get rid of like floats or like the display block thing we said before to do it the Flex way. And anytime we want to use Flexbox, it involves two things. It involves the Flex box, which is like the parent container or parent element, and then it has any of the children inside of that Flex box are now the Flex items. And for each of these things, the Flex box and the Flex items, we can set optional like style parameters for it. So the Flex container has these properties that you can apply: Flex direction, Flex wrap, Flex flow, all of these things. And then the children has another big list of them. So we're going to check out kind of how this would be applied maybe on our project. So, and I'll try and do a few of these so we can get an idea of what each of them does. So the natural position for us to make our Flexbox is on this like main div, or sorry, on the main part. So if we go display, and we go Flex, now our div is saying that all the children in here will be like Flex item children. So in order for this to work properly, we can't have a display setting for our children, so we'll get rid of that because now the Flexbox is taking care of their display. They don't need to be inline, they're Flex because they're children of the Flexbox. The other thing, we're going to get rid of the width right now, so we can illustrate kind of one of the main things that Flexbox does for us. So we'll save that, and we'll check out, refresh this. Actually, we'll get rid of some things. Let's get rid of that ugly red. Let's also get rid of this gutter on left and right side of our main content for now. Font size, line height, margin. Okay, so far, nothing really interesting. We have our three elements kind of floating to the right. They're all taking up the same row. One option we can do in our main, a property we can apply is Flex direction. So we can go column. If we refresh, now our elements are column-wise. The default being row is what we had before, row. So as a default, any items in our Flexbox, they are going to take up as much space as they can in their like given direction. So meaning when I have it column-wise, they're going to take up as much horizontal space as they can, and that will be like adjusted. As we shrink and grow this, they are flexing to fill the size that they can. When we did flex, I get rid of the height here. When we did flex row, our elements now have to, take up horizontal space together, but vertically they just grow to take up as much space as they can that way. If I increase the main's height, so we go height, I give that 500 pixels maybe. Refresh. That's not a very impressive growth. They're growing to take up as much a vertical space as they can. So that's the default for Flexbox. We'll keep it row. But what we can do to kind of see how Flexbox does some pretty cool things in a more interesting way, in a more responsive way, is if I do set so right now, they're growing as much as they can up and down, but if I do set a width and height, if I do a max width, or let's think. Yeah, if I do a max width of, say, 300 pixels, and we'll do a height of 300 pixels, we'll refresh this. Max width 300 pixels, height 300 pixels. Line height margin. If we just leave it at width, will that give us? Okay, there you go. So if we set this, I'm also going to change the font size and line height to something standard so they're not kind of distracting us from what everything else is doing. This was really big, I think, 50 pixels. And our line height will make same as our height. Okay. So if we give our boxes a set height as opposed to just letting them, like Flexbox, grow it as much as they want, the interesting thing that Flexbox does for us is, it will stay 300 pixels in height, or width, sorry, when it has enough room. Each of these elements, can grow to 300 pixels. But when we get smaller than that, Flexbox is going to squish our elements so that they stay on the screen, because it knows it's better to have these kind of be squished than to have that horizontal scroll bar that appears when they're forced to be 300 pixels. So the default is Flexbox going to try and take up as much space, but if we give it a specific width, it will flex or kind of be squished on smaller sizes, and then on bigger sizes, it'll max out at its 300 size that we gave it. And then we already saw flex direction. Some of the other ones we can do. We have flex wrap. So right now we have that squish thing, but if we go flex wrap and we go no wrap, that's already what we have. That's the default, this squishness. But if we do wrap and we refresh, we have 300 pixels, and then when we get below 300, it wraps or it jumps down. So this is now behaving kind of like display block inline. So Flexbox is nice because we have an option to do all of the different type of layouts that we want just with one display type. So that's our flex wrap. If we look at the next one, we had flex flow. This is just a shorthand for direction and wrap. Then we have these three: justify content, align items, and align content. And these all have to do with the alignment of our things. So justify content is the horizontal alignment. Align items is the vertical alignment. And align content is kind of a special one that I'll have to kind of illustrate best to show. So justify content and align items we'll do first. We do justify content, and we do center. Our content will appear in the center whenever it can, whenever there's extra margin space to go around. If we do justify items or align items, we can also say center, and that'll give us horizontal alignment. For each of these, we can give center, or we can do, like I could do flex start. And my elements are going to, prefer the top of the thing. If I do flex end, they're going to, float downwards. So this is the options that kind of give us that float capability. We'll keep it center for now. Save that. And then our last one was align content. And this one, in order to illustrate it properly, we're going to have to go into our HTML. We're going to pick maybe the second div, and we're going to give it a new class. And we'll call it big. For our big class, we're going to say, if you're big, we want your width to be 400 pixels, and we want your height to be 400 pixels. So now if I refresh, center this one, if I refresh, we see that my middle element that is bigger than the other ones, the smaller elements are like vertically aligned in the center to this element. So now we have three levels of alignment. We have the vertical alignment of the whole row, so whether the whole row is starting here, center, or at the top. We have the horizontal alignment, so whether these guys are starting closer to the left or closer to the right or in the center. And then we also have the alignment of each of the items within the row. So right now, they're all aligned center, like the center of them is here. We could have it so that each of these, their tops are all matched along the top of this. If we wanted to do that, we'd just go back in here. We'd go align items. Rid of those. We'll go align items, flex, start. Save that, refresh, and now we see they're all aligned to the top of the row that they're in. So with those three things, we can get everything kind of moving in a nice way. So right now we have our vertical alignment center, our horizontal alignment center, and then our item alignment within the row to be start. And then we still have, I think, wrap right now. So and maybe we'll make our main have a minimum height of 800 pixels so that when our stuff grows, it also increases the size as opposed to overflowing like we had before. And then for the actual flex items, so all of our three divs, we have a bunch of properties that we can set as well. So we can set order, and that is the order of the specific element that we're choosing. So the only kind of one that we can set specific flex item properties on is big right now, because it's the only one that's distinguished from the other two. So in here, I could go order, and I can set it to 1. If we look now, it's back here. If we do this, order is not like its position within the thing. It's if we consider its natural position to be 0, the number is where it should be switched. So 1 is position yourself 1 further in the row. If I do -1, that's position yourself 1 like back here in the row. If I give 0, that is just wherever you are. We only have 3, so we can kind of only do that. But if I give it like a bigger negative number, it's just going to go as left as it can go. So you can reorder elements with this item property if you want to. We also have flex grow, which is how much the element grows relative to other items, and flex shrink. So when we were doing, not the flex wrap, but when we were shrinking the window so that each element would be squished, we can conditionally say whether one item's going to be squished with flex shrink more than other ones. So maybe they're all 200 in width, but as we flex on them, as we shrink them, the middle one maybe is going to shrink faster than the other two. Or when we're regrowing it, we want the middle one to grow slower than the other two. Those are our two options here. Flex basis is probably how we should be setting our width when we're doing flex box. So right now we set a width. Flex basis is better because it's setting the initial width, and flex, it's like the flex way of doing it. And then flex is shorthand for all of these three, the flex, grow, shrink, and the basis. And then align self, that's the same as the property that we had, so that these are all aligned on the top. If we wanted the third one to be, aligned down here, that would be the align self property. So maybe we'll quickly demo one of those. Let's do, so instead of flex wrap, we'll leave it with its default. And then we will, with big, we'll do flex shrink. We'll give it like 2. We'll see how that looks. So as we're shrinking it, it's a little bit subtle, but the 2 box is shrinking much faster than the 1 and 3 boxes. In fact, it's shrinking twice as much as the other 2 because we've set the flex shrink to be 2. So this is nice. Like, we can have the layout that we want when they have enough space, and then when they're smaller, we can kind of give certain elements more importance. I can say shrink this one a lot because I don't really care if they see all of the content with 2 as much as I care about with 1 and 3. Any questions on Flexbox at this point? Cool. It's a tool that you're good. Like, there's a lot of different properties, and the power of Flexbox is kind of in the many combinations that you have with all of these properties. So the best way to start using it is to just practice, experiment, get used to all of these different properties and what they do. One tool you can use is, there's a game called Flex Froggy. Flexbox Froggy. Oh, this is like, we'll go to the first level. So it gives you this frog, and this is all done with CSS here, and it wants you to position, the goal of each level is to position the frog or the multiple frogs on each of their lily pads. So if I do justify content, flex end, that CSS will move him over. Each of the ones, you gotta position them in more and more complex ways. But just running through something like this, kind of shows you the level of complexity that you can get with the layouts. So we can get tons of different layouts, all just using Flexbox. There's also Flexbox Zombies. People really like making Flexbox games. This one is, you have to download it. It's not a browser game, but it's even way more involved than Flexbox Froggy. I think there's, so you have this guy, and based on the layout of the zombies, you have to use different Flexbox stylings to line up your crossbow to get all of them. And as you progress in the game, you unlock new abilities, which are just different Flexbox properties. So I don't know, give it a try. They're kind of fun. Yeah, but I guess the emphasis is that Flexbox is so customizable with your layout, and once you get used to these different properties that you can apply, it will do kind of what you intend, as opposed to having to fiddle so much with your layouts. Next, we're going to be looking at SAS. So SAS is a preprocessor scripting language that is interpreted or compiled into cascading style sheets. So whatever that sentence was, super unhelpful. Essentially, SAS is a way of writing CSS that gives us some extra features, and then it allows us to take that way we've written CSS with new features and just convert it into plain CSS for our HTML or for our web page to use. A preprocessor, which is what SAS is a program that modifies data to conform with the input requirements of another program. So we're writing stuff in SAS, which is kind of this new expressive way of writing CSS, but we're preprocessing it so that it can be used just as pure CSS. Because our browsers and like our HTML documents, they can't use SAS. SAS is like something they're not familiar with, but they can use CSS. So we're just taking something new and changing it back into pure CSS. In the notes, these docs are pretty good. I would suggest giving them a quick read through when you get the notes. But the reason we have SAS is because it's CSS with awesomeness. SAS stands for syntactically awesome style sheets. And like I was saying, SAS is just CSS with some extra features thrown in. But the extra features don't allow you to do new styles. Anything that you can do in CSS, you can also do in SAS, and anything you can do in SAS, you can also do in CSS. So we say that they have the same expressiveness. There's no style you can do in SAS that you can't do in pure CSS. But SAS has these extra functions that just make writing CSS easier. And we'll see how it does that in a second. But the idea is we're not going to be able to do brand new things to our page and how it looks. We're just going to have an easier time in getting them to do the same styles that we've been already looking at. I have one example kind of SAS file. Let's look at this. And I want you guys to point out any differences or things that you see that you wouldn't be able to do in, oh no, not this one. Don't look at that one. Where is it? Oh, here we go, example. That you wouldn't be able to do in normal CSS. So I'm gonna scroll a bit. The most interesting stuff, well, there's some there, kind of happens up here. So what are some things that we see here that stand out as not CSS stuff? The variables, yeah. So we have something up here. We have this $sign. Looks like variables. What else looks new? Nesting, yeah. So they've got a nav element, and then within the brackets, they've got UL, list, and anchor tags. But other than that, it does look a lot like CSS. This thing, well, we have this primary color and font stack, but like this article here, that's almost CSS. We have a division and a multiplication. You can't do that the same way in CSS. You have to use calc. But it looks somewhat familiar. We have this extra nesting, and we have some variables up here, but it doesn't look crazy. And that's what SAS is. SAS is normal CSS with extra things that we can do. And the awesomeness that it adds is variables. Nesting, we have more operators, so we saw the division and multiplication. You can do importing, you can do something called mixins, and something called inheritance. We'll look at these last two later. But those ones there are like the main things you can do. And we kind of saw them in that SAS sheet that we were looking at. Everything that you write in CSS, you can put right into a SAS file, and it'll work normally. What we have to do though is when we're using like node applications or anything, we need to do that pre-processing. We need to convert this example SAS or CSS SCSS file, and we need to change it into CSS. There's a package that you can install just called SAS. So if you do npm install sash, and because we'll be using command line tools with SAS, you want to install it globally. And the command for changing or pre-processing a SAS file into a CSS file is just SAS with the input file's name and the output file's name. So if I go, I think it's up a directory. If I go SAS, and I go example.scss, and I want to put it in output.css, I hit enter. And then we look in my directory. I now have a new file, output.css. And this is the equivalent CSS to the example SCSS. So here we see the body has font 100%, and the color for that font, or the types of font are from the font stack, which is Helvetica and sans serif, and the color is from primary color green. And in output.css, we see that it just has inserted those values directly. The other thing we can do is if we run that same command, but beforehand I do -- watch, and I hit enter, it's going to say SAS is watching for changes. This is like NodeMon or things like that. So now if I do any changes in example, if I want to change the primary color from green to red, and I save that, in the terminal we see it said compiled example to output. And if I look at output, I'll see that the color is now red. So that's helpful. I don't have to think about always manually telling my SCSS file to be changed into CSS. It'll just watch them and automatically update the changes. We're going to look at kind of SASifying our rough layout that we have. But firstly, there's some confusing things with SAS. And the most confusing one is SAS versus SCSS. So I've been talking about SAS, but my file extensions here are SCSS. And when I'm using the command line, I'm using SAS. There's these different things that seem like they're in conflict with each other. And the reason for that is SAS, so syntactically awesome style sheets, is the CSS preprocessor. It's the thing that converts our new CSS files into traditional CSS files, but it's also an option for syntax. This is a SCSS file, but I could make example.sass.sas. They're different though. So what happened was back when SAS was first being created, people got together and they're like, well, we like CSS, but we want to do some things easier. We want to add nesting, we want to add variables, we want to add this extra stuff. So they created SAS, they created the preprocessor, and they created a format for writing these new CSS files. And they said that format will be under the file extension SAS, and it will be a certain way. But when they were making this new syntax for syntactically awesome style sheets, they also said, well, it's really slow when I'm writing CSS that have to like include the opening bracket and the closing bracket. They said, let's have it so you can get rid of those. So we'll just do tab indented styling, and they added some other things into their syntax that made it kind of depart from traditional CSS syntax, and to them made it much faster to write CSS. But as Sass became more popular, there was also like a backlash, and people said like, we like the new features that Sass adds. We like nesting, we like variables, we like some of the other stuff. But I don't like having to use this new syntax. I want to just be able to use my already tried and true CSS syntax. I want to be able to copy, paste styles from my CSS file into Sass stuff, but add the new functionality. So they created a second file type with syntax that is very similar to CSS syntax. So .scss is an extension of CSS where all CSS syntax is valid, but you can also use enhanced features from Sass. That's what we looked at with our example. You can look into the alternative syntax option, Sass, if you want. You may find it faster, but in general, SCSS is going to be better for you because you already know how to do it pretty much. Yeah, so preprocessor is Sass, and then our two kind of syntax options are Sass or SCSS. From now on, we're just going to be focusing on SCSS. So let's go maybe into our project, and let's make a new file, and we're going to call it sassy.scss. If you're using VS Code, it recognizes the file extension and gives you this little like the logo for Sassy stuff. And then from my index, or sorry, my style.css, I can just copy all of this, and I can paste it directly into my SCSS file if I want to. And this would be valid SCSS. There's nothing I would need to do to change this. In fact, if we stop this from being watched and we go back down into responsive, and if I go sass -- watch sassy.scss, and I want to output it to maybe sassy.css. I hit enter. I now have that new sassy.css in my directory, and I can use that instead of style.css. Sassy.css. I save, and we refresh this. It's going to look the same, kind of trivially, because I just copy pasted everything that was in the CSS into the Sassy one. But it is working. And to prove that's working, if I go into my the sassy.scss and I change the background color to blue, I save that. In here, it says it compiled the Sassy file into the CSS file. And if I refresh, the changes are now updated to my project. So I only have to make changes in the SCSS file, and watch will change them in the CSS, and then my index page is requiring the CSS file and will get all the changes. But there's no point in using SCSS if you're not going to be using the features. If I just keep this as vanilla JavaScript, I just have like CSS with extra steps. I don't have like CSS with awesomeness. So the first thing maybe we can do is we can add some variables. So I can say we have a primary color. That can be maybe the cornflower blue. We have a accent color. That's salmon. And then we have a light color. That was wheat. And now anywhere where I'm using salmon, I can use my variable instead. Anywhere I'm using wheat, I can use my light color variable. Cornflower was primary, and salmon was accent. So if I save this, refresh, we have the same color, but we're doing it through variables. And the nice thing about this is I now have like a color palette that I have a single source for. If I decide that my accent color shouldn't be salmon, it should be this pink one. Pink, I can change it for all the cases where I'm using that accent color. Our project's pretty limited in the CSS, so that's only 2. Like, I'm not saving myself a lot because I'm only using the variable twice. But you could see as your project grew, and maybe you're using accent colors in different places throughout the whole thing. If traditional CSS, then you want to change that color. You're saying this style or this color palette seems a little outdated. I don't like it so much. I want to change this pink to salmon. You have to go and find every instance of salmon and edit it back to the new color. Whereas this case, we can just go salmon. So that's the first thing we can do in our project. What's another thing we could do based on maybe even these 2 things here? Yeah, we can do nesting because we have our main tag, and then we have a div tag, which is a child of a main tag. So instead of having this as a separate thing, we can get rid of that, and we can nest our div styling inside of our main styling. So now this is just like more intuitively structured. So it makes sense that when we have main, anything in if we have a div inside of it, it's a style that is a child of main. The other thing this helps with is it organizes our code. When I have it like this, there's nothing stopping me from taking this and moving it all the way down here. So now when I'm going through my styles later, I'm thinking, okay, where was that? Like, oh, here's main. I know there's a child of main that has a style where it should be right here, but it's not, and I got to scroll down, find it somewhere else. Nesting. Whoa. Nesting makes it, like, forces you to have it more organized, and then it also, of course, lets you declare children styles with less code or less writing. So that's a nice one. The other thing we can do is something that the notes mentioned. And that was this thing called a mix-in. A mix-in is we can declare a block of style that we can use in multiple places. A mix-in, well, both mix-ins and inheritance are tools to like help us dry up our CSS. So in JavaScript and things, we have the option of making a function when we have repeating code. In normal CSS, we don't have any option like that to reduce repeating code. But with Sass, we have 2 options, mix-ins and inheritance. Mix-ins being, actually, we already have an example of a mix-in. Example CSS we saw here. This is a mix-in, so it's declared with @mixin, and then it functions very similar to a function. In fact, you give it, a parameter, and it will set a couple sets of styles. So this box, we're going to include the transform mix-in, and we're passing in this parameter. And now box is the same as if we copied this and pasted this in here, and instead of property, we use that rotate 30 that was passed in, rotate 30. So this mixin looks like that it's applying transform for different browser types, WebKit, MS, and the normal transform. And instead of having to repeat this 3 times in box and then 3 times again in box 2, they made a mixin so that they could do it, with any rotation. The other way we'll look at is we'll do the inheritance instead example with our guy. So what if we decided that we wanted a second logo? So we have logo in our header. If we also wanted a logo in our footer, but we didn't want it to look the same, we want it to be like a small like icon logo or something. Or maybe we'll do logo small. Like we wanted it just to be the like tower. There would be some things that it would have in common with our current logo. So the bad way of doing it would be to copy and do a logo small. And then the only thing that's different is instead of logo would go small. So I have a picture here, this guy. So with this, we have a bunch of repeating code. We have, well, the background size contained, background size no repeat. That's stuff that we're going to want to do with every logo. Maybe the width and height, that's standard for all of our logos. So we get a lot of repeating code. Instead, we can declare a class, and we can call this like logo style or something. So a class, maybe we'll call it my logo. And in here, we can set up some general styles for any logo. So for any logo, we're going to want the height. We want the background size to be contained. We don't want it repeating, and maybe we want the same width and height for all of it. And then inside of logo and logo small, instead of repeating those stuff, we can just keep the one new thing or the one specific thing that we want, which is the actual image source. And then we can go @extend, and then the class that we want, my logo. Same here. @extend my logo. So now we have less repeat code, and if we refresh our guy here,
I think they're just small versus small on the small logo.
oh yeah. We also had something else happening. Sorry? Oh yeah. So we need this in the main. Okay, so refresh. Our top logo looks the same, but now we have this bottom logo. So we're reducing repeat styling. I like it better when it wraps. The other cool thing is we can combine this inheritance or this class with our media queries. So our logo, we want it to pop smaller when it's below 400 pixels. And instead of grabbing the one logo class or doing .logo, logo small, we can just say any one that uses the my logo class. So this is the base my logo styling, and both of these are my logos essentially, but with some extra stuff. We can say for any of the my logos, we want them both to have that media query applied to them. So now if I refresh, our top guy drops smaller, but also the bottom one. This is like kind of the most basic example maybe for classes. But if you see any repeating code in your CSS, or you have a certain style for like media queries that you want to apply to a bunch of different things. Inheritance and classes are a good way to do it. So classes being, this is the class, and inheritance being this logo now inherits all of these style from the MyLogo class. It gets all of the, it's all the styles that MyLogo has plus anything else it wants to add. So the stuff that we want to add is the particulars of the logo image. And again, this whole time, I've just been editing the .scss file, and my watch thing has been updating it to CSS. Oh, the one thing to look out for, so when you're maybe using Sass with your projects, you've been using Vagrant as a development environment, and you might have encountered already that with Vagrant, when you're using like node monitor things, sometimes it doesn't restart. Similar with the Sass watch, it's if you edit the sassy.scss, it's not necessarily going to know that you changed it and recompile it to CSS. And the reason for that is most of these watch things or nodemon things, they are watching the file to see if any editor or any program has opened that file and changed it. But with your setup, you have Vagrant where the watching is happening, where you've run Sass or where you've run nodemon. It's watching the file. But then outside of Vagrant, in a totally separate operating system, your home operating system for your computer, you are opening the file and changing it. So there's that disconnect there where the watch doesn't see that anything's opened or modified the file, so it doesn't update. The solution to this is something called polling. So polling is an older method of watching where the thing that's watching just like sticks its finger in the file every once in a while and checks if any changes have been like actually done. So it's just like every couple milliseconds, like poking the thing and seeing like, are you different? With Sass, we can do -- poll, I believe. Yeah, and this will, kind of manually check for changes every second. So if you want to do this with Vagrant, use the -- poll thing. If you're having problems with a nodemon not refreshing, you can add the --L flag, or you can let me know and I'll come help you set it up properly with Vagrant. Yeah, so in general, Sass, like it helps you do those extra features, those new awesome features or whatever. I would suggest you start using it, even if you're not using those features a lot right away, because you can just use the CSS that you've already used. And if you get kind of comfortable with the pipeline of compiling your CSS file into SCSS, down the road when you're working somewhere and they want you to use CSS and Sass, you'll be comfortable with kind of like how it works. And the variables and nesting things, they're pretty helpful, and it's pretty easy to just kind of use them in your code. Yeah, that's everything we're gonna cover today. Any questions on Sass and SCSS? Or on like useful ways of how you could use them? Oh, one quick thing maybe before we finish up. If I had a second SCSS file that I was using, I could do it anywhere, but I could go at import, and then I could give it the file name. So sassy2.scss. And so now I can have multiple SCSS files. I could have sassy2. I could have maybe another file that's just on my nav bar. I could have another one that's just for maybe like a footer or something. And because I've imported them, one, my watch, even though I'm just watching sassy.scss, it will be looking at these files too because I've imported them. And then when it does the pre-processing of converting this example or if either of these, like example.scss or sassy.scss, it will take this file, insert all of these SCS files into it, and then combine the now 4 files into one CSS file. So I get the benefit of I can have a nice division of functionality or division of styles, having multiple style sheets. And then in my HTML, I'm just using a single CSS file, the one compiled file. The other benefit to doing this, if I declare, maybe the better example is in here. If I had declared these variables before I import all this stuff, Sassy2, my navbar, footer are now all going to have access to light color, accent color, and primary color variables. So now I have multiple files with shared variables. It helps me not have super long files of code, but I can compile them all into one CSS file, so it's very simple to include them in my HTML. I can just have this one style sheet linked, which is just like a combination of all of the styles that I need. That is like kind of one useful pipeline for setting this up.
So all the ones that you import have to be partials, right?
Here,
Yeah.
they don't have to be partials.
They could just be, SCSS stuff.
Yeah, they can be like normal files. I think pure CSS after Sass has become pretty prevalent, has started to add a few small things. So you can do imports with CSS, and that's when you're looking at partials and stuff. The problem with imports in CSS is that it does the imports on load. So when you include, say, sassy.css, if that was just a normal CSS file that had to import, your front end loads the initial CSS, it finds the import, and then it does a second fetch to get the new thing. So it's a less efficient way than the way Sass does it. The other thing that CSS has ended up adding is, so we saw here that we could just inline do division and multiplication. They you can do math stuff in CSS too, but you have to do it with calc. So you have to do calc, and then I don't actually remember. I never use, so CSS calc. Yeah, so you'd use calc, and then you can use just different operators within calc. But if I did 100% minus 80 pixels outside of this in pure CSS, it would not let me. But Sass lets you do it. But yeah, this would be like a good way to start maybe using Sass if you want to. If you think of any questions, come find me. I'll be around. I'll put up these notes pretty quickly. And yeah, thank you guys. Let me know if anything comes up.